Should be able to see something now, I think, folks. Was it Julius who was here earlier? Okay, let's have some radio on.
Falling down into low single figures. Could be a touch of frost actually in rural areas. Now for Northern Ireland and for Scotland, showers will continue here on and off through the course of the night, and some of these will be quite heavy, even wintry over the tops of high ground above 400 metres or so. It will be quite a cold night. Temperatures down to 3 degrees in the towns and cities, but lower than that in rural areas. Now tomorrow, you'll be pleased to hear, will be a much calmer day. We'll still have outbreaks of rain to start the day across eastern England.
If you want to spread the word around, guys, you can do.
Follow. And actually across most of the British showers, we are looking at a fine day with sunny spells. There will though be further blustery showers for Northern Ireland and Scotland, and a fresher feel to the weather as well. Temperatures around 8 degrees. That's the latest weather. Eddie.
Thanks, Chris. This is PM. I'm Eddie Mayer. We'll see you tomorrow at 5.
I guess that means it's 6 o'clock. Bong!
BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Harriet Gass. Good evening. The Chief Executive of the Royal Opera House, Tony Hall, has been chosen as the next Director General of the BBC. The Chairman of the BBC Trust, Lord Patton, said he was delighted that Lord Hall, a former BBC News executive, had agreed to help rebuild trust in the corporation after the criticism of its handling of child abuse allegations. David Cameron has gone into EU budget talks in Brussels, repeating his demand for a freeze in spending and the retention of the British rebate. The long-standing Chief Constable has announced his retirement after being told to reapply for his job by the new Police and Crime Commissioner for his area. People in southwest England and North Wales are preparing for more flooding as rain and high winds batter the country. 2 months after leaving office, the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has faced a grilling by a judge in Bordeaux. A former head of BBC News, Tony Hall, has been named as the corporation's new Director General. Tony Hall, Lord Hall of Birkenhead, is the current Chief Executive of the Royal Opera House in London. He was appointed unanimously after being approached directly by the BBC Trust, despite some calls for a complete outsider to be appointed. Tony Hall will succeed George Entwistle, who resigned earlier this month after only 54 days in the job. His departure followed a Newsnight report which led to the former Conservative Treasurer Lord McAlpine being wrongly implicated in allegations of child abuse. Tony Hall will take up the post in March. The chairman of the BBC Trust, Lord Patton, says he's the right man to lead the organisation and restore the reputation of its journalism. Our first report tonight is by our media correspondent, Doreen Douglas.
Tony Hall had emerged in recent
Is everything working okay, guys, or not?
Stabilising the BBC and leading it out of its current crisis. Widely credited with helping turn round the Royal Opera House, which had been in crisis before he joined as Chief Executive, he'd also worked at the BBC for many years, latterly as Head of News when it launched Radio 5 Live, the BBC News website and its TV news channel. But today's announcement came more quickly than many had expected. Lord Patton said he'd made a direct approach to Tony Hall, who'd not been available when the job was advertised earlier in the year because he'd been running the Cultural Olympiad. Lord Patton acknowledged that trust in BBC journalism had taken a knock, and he was delighted that Tony Hall would lead the way in restoring its reputation.
The BBC has faced, for the third time in 25 years, the departure of a Director General because of mistakes with our journalism. And that in a great journalistic and news organisation was. And we needed to react to that, and react to that fast.
Tony Hall said it had taken a lot to drag him away from his previous position as Chief Executive of the Royal Opera House.
I care passionately about the BBC, about what it can do, its programme makers, and the impact we have in all sorts of different ways. It's one of those extraordinary organisations which is an absolutely essential part of the UK, of Britain, of who we are, but also has this incredible impact around the world too.
Earlier, a member of the BBC Trust, Anthony Fry, had told MPs that the previous Director General, George Entwistle, had made it clear he wanted a full year's salary, £450,000, as a condition of leaving quickly and quietly. Tony Hall will have to build bridges there too, if he's to restore the BBC's reputation and end its current crisis.
The Culture Secretary Maria Miller has welcomed the appointment of Tony Hall, saying his track record is strong.
Tony brings a great deal of experience, not just within the BBC, but outside as well. He's worked in iconic organisations that have faced their problems and shown that he knows how to get those organisations through those sorts of difficult times.
The Labour leader, Ed Miliband, described Tony Hall as a proven leader and an excellent choice. But the former BSkyB and ITV executive, David Elstein, said he found the appointment puzzling.
Tony's an excellent person who was turned down for the job in 1999 when Greg Knight was selected and couldn't be bothered to apply for the job last time, which is only 8 months ago. Moreover,
Charming, sour grapes.
of approaching and being offered the job then is past the BBC retirement date. I mean, it's just a sign of
Sour grapes.
how hopeless the BBC Trust and chairman are.
Tony Hall himself has expressed confidence that the BBC can get over its difficulties and rebuild its reputation. This profile of the new Director General is by our correspondent Nick Hyle.
Tony Hall's appointment arguably satisfies those who thought the BBC needed an outsider to restore its credibility and confidence, but he's also an insider who knows the BBC well. He originally joined as a news trainee and was a youthful editor of the 9 o'clock news before becoming head of all news and current affairs. Though some staff were inclined to mock his boyish demeanour, he impressed many with his editorial nous and cool head. Steve Hewlett was editor of Panorama when the programme secured an explosive interview with Princess Diana. The interview's existence had to be kept from the then chairman of the BBC, Marmaduke Hussey, whose wife was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen.
That was a programme which had that gone wrong. Of course, it would have not been Newsnight to have cocked hat in terms of the BBC's reputation and so on. Personally, I found him straightforward, honest, no side to him, no pushover, and a delight to work with. I think he brings to the BBC what it most urgently needs at this point, which is, you might say, weight.
Tony Hall applied for the top job at the BBC in 1999. When he didn't get it, he left to run the Royal Opera House, which had had 3 chief executives in 3 years. At one point, the entire board had resigned. The new man restored stability, widened access, pioneered big screen relays and productions, doubled the organisation's turnover.
Is everything working okay, gentlemen?
Rejected Tony Hall in favour of Greg
Can
Dyke
you see
in
anything or not?
1999.
Last time round,
Or is it choppy?
when Greg Dyke got the job, one of the things against him was all his experience had been within the BBC. Well, he's been an extremely successful chief executive of the Royal Opera House, which has almost as many prima donnas as the BBC, and he's done a really, really good job there. So I think he is the complete article.
During his time at Covent Garden, Tony Hall has kept in touch with broadcasting as a director and latterly deputy chairman of Channel 4. Until today, he professed himself quite happy outside the BBC. He told the Daily Telegraph last December, "Obviously, I would have loved to have become the BBC's DG, but life has a funny way of turning out."
Lord McAlpine has agreed a settlement of £125,000 with ITV and the presenter Philip Schofield, who handed the Prime Minister a list of alleged child abusers live on air. Lord McAlpine's solicitor Andrew Reid described the settlement as sensible. He said 200 people who published allegations on Twitter had since apologised, but others have continued to repeat the claims on Twitter and other social media, and this was now a matter for the police. European Union leaders have begun what's likely to be a long and tough round of negotiations in Brussels on the EU's next budget from 2014 to 2020. The European Commission had proposed a 5% increase in spending, but a group of countries, including Britain, argue that any rise at a time of austerity would be unacceptable. David Cameron has also said a compromise plan put forward by the EU President
expecting a bruising and bitter battle over the EU's next 7-year budget. Among the first to arrive was David Cameron, regarded by many as the potential spoiler. He repeated his demand for the budget to be frozen or cut.
These are very important negotiations. Clearly, at a time when we're making difficult decisions at home over public spending, it would be quite wrong, it is quite wrong, for there to be proposals for this increased extra spending in the EU. So we're going to be negotiating very hard for a good deal for Britain's taxpayers and for Europe's taxpayers, and to keep the British rebate.
The Prime Minister was the first leader to brief the EU's most senior officials on his position. A scheduled 15-minute meeting lasted 35 minutes as David Cameron challenged them over salaries and perks. The British do have allies in countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, and several supportive leaders urged David Cameron to compromise. Among them the Finnish
There's
Prime
no
Minister,
compromise, it's got to be frozen.
I know that there have been some disagreements with the budgetary lines, but nevertheless we all have some preconditions and we all must be ready for compromise.
The original budget proposal was for over €1 trillion. The President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, has drafted a new plan that comes in 80 billion lower. It does amount to a slight cut in spending. The British say that it's a step forward, but does not go far enough. They are also having to resist calls for a reduction in the UK rebate as part of any deal. But there is a large group of countries which benefits from EU grants, and they want a budget increase. And France says it will not accept a cut in farm subsidies. All reason why
it's long overdue that France took a cut in farm subsidies. They promised it last time when Blair let them have some of our rebate back, and they didn't deliver then. Enough is enough.
And voted for a cut in the EU budget. Political editor Nick Robinson, who's in Brussels, considers the Prime Minister's position.
France has got too many farmers.
Are likely to satisfy his and his party's demands.
He was first in, will he be first out? David Cameron chose to be the first EU leader to meet the man chairing this summit. His aim to show that he'd come to seek a deal and was not just set on vetoing one. The budget which is currently being proposed is not far from Britain's first demand. No real increase in EU spending, but it breaches the second. No cut to the UK's rebate. It sets the ceiling for planned EU spending, the equivalent of Europe's credit limit, just below where it is now, at €940 billion. David Cameron is arguing that actual spending should be cut further than that. He's proposed cutting billions from infrastructure schemes, which the European Commission wants to expand, and much smaller, though politically significant symbolically, sums from the cost of the Brussels administration by raising the staff pension age and scrapping bonuses paid to non-Belgian staff. It's a reminder that the Prime Minister isn't just negotiating with 26 other EU leaders or the EU's 2 presidents. He's also negotiating, at least in his head, with the Tory backbenchers who defeated him in the Commons just a couple of weeks ago.
The long-serving Chief Constable, Colin Port of Avon and Somerset, is to stand down, saying he's been told to reapply for his job by the area's newly elected Police and Crime Commissioner. It's the first day at work for the commissioners, who have the power to appoint and dismiss senior officers in England and Wales. Nearly a third of Chief Constable posts are vacant, prompting concern that there may be a shortage of experienced replacements. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Danny Shaw.
Less than a week after being voted in, police and crime commissioners are flexing their muscles. The West Midlands Labour's PCC, Bob Jones, said he was scrapping plans to privatise some policing services. But the bigger surprise came in Avon and Somerset, when Colin Port, who's led the force for almost 8 years, announced his retirement. Mr. Port's contract expires in January. It's understood he was keen for it to be renewed for another year. The PCC, Sue Mount Stevens, who stood as an independent, said she wanted to advertise the post. Mr. Port decided not to apply. Ms. Mount Stevens, a former magistrate and police authority member, said there'd be no dispute between them.
There is not a conflict. The contract ends. His contract ends. He has done 38 years. You know,
but with temporary leaders in place. The numbers expected to increase as others reach the end of their contracts or approach retirement age. Former Thames Valley Police Chief Peter Nehru says there may not be enough sufficiently experienced candidates to replace them.
There is a danger that what will happen now is that PCCs will enter a sort of bidding between each other to pick up the best candidates.
I'm surprised nobody's turned up, Julius. I was expecting some others besides you.
Which I think would be not in the public interest.
These are uncertain times for the police service, though few expected PCCs to have such an immediate impact.
Large parts of England and North Wales are suffering significant disruption this evening as strong winds and torrential rain sweep across the country for a second day. In North Wales, police are urging the public not to travel unless it's absolutely necessary. And in Cumbria, train services have been cancelled because of flooding. In the southwest and the Midlands, around 100 homes and businesses are already underwater, and commuters have suffered widespread disruption. Correspondent Sarah Ransom reports from one of the western areas, South Devon.
Strong winds and rain have battered much of the UK this afternoon, with gusts of up to 70 miles per hour already recorded in the Scillies. Torrential rain is now hitting the West Country and Wales, sweeping in a band up to Cumbria. Some areas have had as much as 5 inches falling on already saturated ground. Homes and businesses have been flooded, and around 1,000 people staying at a holiday park in Northamptonshire had to be evacuated as water levels rose. With dozens of flood warnings in place tonight, one Somerset council is getting emergency reception areas ready just in case. Alison Baptiste is a flood risk manager from the Environment Agency.
It has been very wet, and we've got about 100 properties flooded over the southwest and some of the Midlands, and very much thoughts with those people who are being flooded because it is a traumatic experience.
Whoops.
But unfortunately, with the rain that is coming over the next few days, there is a risk that there will be more flooded properties.
Some schools were shut today, and many roads in the west are still closed because of fallen trees and flooding. And in the worst affected areas, motorists are being warned not to travel unless they have to.
In Scotland, the southwest of the country has been worst affected. In Dumfries, the River Nith is beginning to flood for the second time in a week. You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far: the chairman of the BBC Trust, Lord Patton, has said he believes the man chosen to be the next Director General of the corporation, Tony Hall, will restore trust in its journalism. The Prime Minister has joined other European leaders in crucial budget talks, saying he's not happy with the latest proposals on future spending. Still to come, the South Sea island that never was.
Hey?
The Justice Secretary, Chris Grayling, has asked a joint committee of MPs and peers to consider again proposals to give some prisoners the right to vote. MPs have previously rejected the idea of allowing inmates to take part in elections, but the European Court of Human Rights says a blanket ban is unlawful. It remains unclear whether or not Britain could legally reject the court's ruling, but Mr Grayling, who opposes the move, said it was ultimately a decision for Parliament. Here's our chief political correspondent, Ben Wright.
They're proposals the government does not want to implement. Number 10, Labour, and almost all MPs are firmly opposed to giving convicted prisoners the vote. But Britain's blanket ban has been ruled unlawful by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and ministers had to produce a response by tomorrow. So, in the Commons, the Justice Secretary Chris Grayling explained the government's 3 options. Give the vote to prisoners serving sentences of less than 4 years, or those serving less than 6 months. Alternatively, keep the ban as it is. It was that choice that triggered a cheer from MPs, including the Conservative David Davis.
This is a non-partisan parliamentary issue, not one that should be a matter of debate between parties but across the House. And in that context, I congratulate my right honourable friend for doing exactly the right thing in this bill and handing the decision back to Parliament.
Chris Grayling said he took the obligation to uphold the rule of law in this case very seriously, but argued the sovereignty of Parliament meant it had the final decision over what should happen, not the Strasbourg court. The human rights lawyer and Liberal Democrat Pierre Lester said Britain should comply with the court's ruling.
The reason why I say this stains our reputation is that in Beijing, only 3 weeks ago, the Chinese were saying, why should we think about the rule of law if Britain can't abide by this judgment? It is an appalling blot on our entire record. We have always abided by judgments of the Strasbourg Court, and I really believe that Mr Cameron should think again.
A joint committee of Parliament will now consider the plans, and a full bill may not be published until 2014. Ministers want the blanket ban kept in place, but Chris Grayling warned there would be a political cost in doing so.
If Parliament decides to defy the European Court of Human Rights and continue to prevent convicted prisoners from voting, there may be significant legal and political consequences. And as our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman explains, Britain has upheld controversial rulings from Europe before, albeit through gritted teeth.
Following the shooting dead of 3 IRA members in Gibraltar in 1988 by an SAS team, the European Court of Human Rights ordered the UK government to pay compensation.
Hi Pedro, you're arriving almost at the end of the journey again.
By the judgment of the court and paid
Congratulations.
Up. It realised that failing to do so would undermine the international standing of the UK as a country that respected human rights and the rule of law. The coalition government is in a similar bind. The court's 2005 decision that the UK's blanket ban on prisoner voting was unlawful means that the government has to act to change the law. But Parliament's sovereign, and it can't be forced to legislate. If the government whipped the vote, it might be thought to have done enough to comply with the court. But if, as seems likely, a vote is held unwhipped and the vote is for no change, where's the government left legally? It seems unlikely that the Committee of Ministers, which oversees the enforcement of judgments, will regard it as having done its best to bring about change. Instead, the government would be censured and face compensation claims from serving prisoners. That would be costly in political and financial terms.
Oh dear, we've got a traffic jam.
More costly still would be the damage to the UK's international reputation.
The Israeli government has warned that it's prepared to resume military operations against Palestinian militants in Gaza if the ceasefire, which came into force last night, doesn't hold. The Israeli army has begun withdrawing columns of vehicles from the Gaza border.
I think we might be late for this talk.
Has declared today a public holiday to mark what it hailed as a victory over Israel. This report is by our Middle East correspondent Kevin Connolly.
On one of the main roads leading north from Gaza this afternoon, it was impossible to escape the sight of Israeli military vehicles heading away from what would have been the front line. At one motorway junction, we passed a convoy of tank transporters, accompanied by their truckloads of high-explosive shells. Israel says its war aim was simple: to stop the rocket fire against its southern towns and cities, which made them places of almost permanent anxiety. The Israelis do have a red line, a certain number of rocket attacks beyond which they would resume air raids. The Deputy Prime Minister Dan Meridor wouldn't say today what that number was.
I don't want to give an exact recipe, but I would say that they need to keep the border entirely quiet. I don't want to give them license to do up to a certain level. Nothing should cross the border against us.
Only if the ceasefire holds will talks begin on issues which have bedeviled the region for years and which will be long and difficult. Can the crossing point between
I'm just
Gaza
wondering
and
if there's
Egypt be
flooding
opened
ahead or
more
something.
often to more goods and more people without becoming a conduit for
not.
more weapons smuggled from Iran? Can Hamas rein in smaller groups of militants who might fire rockets purely to destroy the ceasefire? Palestinians also want the right to farm all the way up to the Israeli fence around Gaza, regaining the use of their own land, from which they're currently barred by Israeli security measures. For all the bloodshed, Hamas officials like Ihab Hussein are already inclined to celebrate the deal as a victory.
We have 162 people were killed for this victory. All the Palestinian conditions that they had it. They will open the borders. They will stop, assassinate and kill our people. We will live in calm and in peace.
Like any ceasefire, this one will be maintained as long as it suits the two parties to maintain it. But Israeli officials believe they have seriously degraded the military capability of Hamas. They point to a similar operation against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon 6 years ago as evidence that a ceasefire built on such foundations can last.
The former French president Nicolas Sarkozy has been questioned for more than 10 hours by a judge in Bordeaux who's investigating the financing of his election campaign in 2007. It's alleged that funds were secured illegally from France's richest woman,
why we're not moving here.
heiress Liliane Bettencourt. Mr. Sarkozy has repeatedly denied the accusations. Christian Fraser reports from Paris.
He was the mayor of the wealthiest suburb in Paris. It gave him access to the country's richest woman. And over the years, Mr. Sarkozy had forged a close friendship with Liliane Bettencourt. He was, said staff, a regular visitor to the family home in Neuilly. But the allegation is that in the final few months of the 2007 election, Mr. Sarkozy took advantage of the ageing L'Oréal heiress, persuading her to part with huge amounts of money to help bankroll his bid for the presidency. An accountant who worked for Miss Bettencourt claims tens of thousands of euros were handed over to his campaign manager, Eric Wirth, and on a separate occasion, Mr. Sarkozy came in person, she said, to receive his envelope stuffed with cash. The former president has repeatedly denied the allegations, but on the orders of the judge, his office and home were raided in July. Today, one poll suggested the majority of French people would still prefer Mr. Sarkozy to return and lead his fractured party. Certainly he harbours those ambitions, but his chances of return could yet be poisoned by the inquiry he's facing.
MPs are requesting an urgent meeting with the next Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby.
Now we're going to be stuck again at this next junction, I think.
Not to allow women bishops. Speaking earlier in the Nigerian capital, Abuja, Bishop Welby said there was absolutely no question that the rules would eventually be reformed. His comments came as the MP who represents the Church of England in the Commons, Sir Tony Baldry, warned that it now looked like a sect rather than a national church. Ross Hawkins reports from Westminster.
MPs on opposing sides of the House were united in condemning the decision not to allow women to become bishops and demanding that the General Synod think again. It was Sir Tony Baldry's job to speak for the Church of England in the Commons, but he offered little comfort when he described what he believed to be the consequences of the Synod's decision.
The Church of England...
We're going to be stuck here for at least 5 minutes.
Church, it simply looks like a sect like any other sect. And if the Church of England wishes to be a national church reflecting the nation, then it has to reflect the values of the nation.
In an interview, he later warned the Synod's powers were granted by Parliament and said what Parliament gave, it could take away. But it's not the church establishment that needs convincing. Speaking in Nigeria today, the next Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said it was clear women would become bishops in the Church of England. Instead, MPs and church figures so vocal in their condemnation of the Synod's conclusion must change.
I've got 5 minutes to get to a concert talk, and we're stuck in a jam here.
In the city, the 100 show index ended the day up 39 points at 5,791.
And I don't think we're going anywhere fast.
In New York, markets are closed for Thanksgiving. On the currency markets, the pound was down 0.5% against the dollar at $1.59. Against the euro, the pound was down 0.5% at €1.24, and that makes a euro worth nearly 81 pence. The Football Association has said the referee Mark Clattenburg will not face any disciplinary action over accusations that he racially abused a Chelsea player during a Premier League match last month. The organisation that manages referees says it will now record the conversations of match officials where possible. With more details is our sports correspondent Gordon Farker.
The FA carried out a lengthy investigation and concluded that the Chelsea player who said he heard the
the weather is grim, yes, you're quite right.
And that his allegation was not supported by any